Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. One of the things that many people might feel by the time they reach midlife is that feeling of loneliness. This is one of those things that can actually occur to a person at pretty much any age. The question is being able to decide what is loneliness. Is it the same thing as being alone, or is it something much different? On the Beyond 50 radio program today, we're joined by a marvelous guest who is known as the See-Through Coach and an award-winning and best-selling author of The Path to Wisdom. His newest book is #Loneliness, and he specializes in assisting people to unleash their true potential, accelerate their learning, and achieve excellence. It's interesting as we dive into this world of loneliness to discover how we have become accustomed to a new way of being alone together in a technological cocoon that covers up our real pain. Our true essence is also hidden behind the facades that we show to the world from the fear of being judged, criticized, and rejected. This is what brings us out of the natural state of healthy balance. It can also be the root cause of many diseases and what creates the segregation experienced worldwide. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest and author of the book #Loneliness, the Virus of the Modern Age, our guest, Tony Salimi. Tony, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, when I first got this book here from the producer, I thought, okay, well, here's a book on loneliness, and I was really kind of surprised as I began reading your book how you approach this particular subject. Most people would talk about loneliness and what creates it, but yours was more personal, and you also share stories from others as well to show how you can evolve away from feeling lonely or actually being lonely to someone who can be accustomed to being alone but still feeling alive and, pretty much spiritually connected to everything. Tell us, first of all, how you came up with the idea to write this book.
Well, there are a number of reasons that I actually came up with the idea. First of all, as you very correctly mentioned, I wanted to share with the reader my personal journey through loneliness. Secondly, on one hand, we have become so connected, yet on the other hand, we are desperately alone in our hearts, living in this technological cocoon that truly covers the real pain that we feel inside, the shame that we must have done something and others will judge us, and then live with the guilt, some form of guilt, no matter what we do. And what happens is, as the time passes on, we start to hide who we truly are behind facades that they become walls. And then we become fearful from being judged by the society, being abandoned, being rejected, and therefore creating massive isolation. But the other reason I also wrote #Loneliness is the alarming statistics that are there about how many homes are occupied, for instance, with lonely people. Sweden is 47% of Swedish people, households are occupied by single people. And America is not far behind. It's about 28% of American households are comprised of just one person. Clearly, this will have a massive impact in the way our living is going to be happening, and also into our old age. But the many adversities that I mentioned in #Loneliness were equally painful, that brought me some of the greatest breakthroughs in my life. And having worked with thousands of people, I really felt inspired. What can I do to really tackle a global problem that now through social media is easily spread into a collective consciousness, creating that segregation, that war, that everything we're experiencing currently, and we've had many events this year that really shook us all to the core.
And it's really interesting, too, especially when you consider this presidential election that we had going on here in 2016, and the feeling that social media somehow influenced the decisions, especially of the younger millennials, about the direction they decided to go in this particular voting process. And having living in Portland, Oregon, in the Northwest, we managed to land ourselves on the map with the big protests against who we decided to elect for president. And you take a look at this, and what was really interesting is there is a person who produces some videos on YouTube, and he was in America, but I guess now he's having trouble with his visa getting extended. He really, wants to be an American. What's interesting about him is that he is natural born outside the United States. He is a Muslim. He loves America. He loves what America stands for. What he did was a short YouTube video basically talking about the perplexities that he felt about this whole election process and the perception of it all, especially through the eyes of the millennials. And it was interesting. He says, it's very confusing to understand this, and this is why. He would show, for instance, there was a scene in the part of his video here that shows how people, didn't want to vote for Donald Trump. So they would ask, well, why do you want to do that? Well, I just hate Donald Trump, this, that, and the other. And it was really interesting, when you see the anger and the outrage that Hillary Clinton didn't win. Now, what was funny about this is immediately the broadcaster who was actually, talking to his people out on the streets, one particular person, he asked him, well, what do you think about, her emails and the Benghazi and all this and that and the other? And the guy says, I really don't care. And what he was really showcasing, and we also followed this up with an interview as well, is that these people weren't really taking the time to develop an understanding of politics, the political process, and so forth and so on. They just sort of in a shallow way grabbed these bits and pieces from social media without diving deeper into the matter of knowing what it really is and making a good informed decision. And I just found it fascinating. Here was an outsider's view about what goes on here in America, and that really hits home on loneliness a little bit, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the loneliness, I actually was in San Diego during the elections. I was interviewed by Brian Tracy on NBC, ABC, and CBS and Fox channels. And it was interesting to observe how one thing that was meant to really unite the country separated the country in such a way that created tremendous outrest across different parties, whether it's Democrats or Republicans. For me, as a teacher of inner wisdom, I appreciate and love every human being on the planet. So it's it is extremely this polarized view that media and social media can literally influence people without having the depth of knowledge to actually make an informed decision. And we in Britain experienced the same thing with Brexit. Without most of the people who were interviewed, this is almost 99.9% of people who were interviewed, they had no idea why they voted Brexit. They just picked up few things that were done throughout the campaign, but then later on were found out to be untrue. And there's been so many revelations after the campaign that people are shocked. But you know what? This is how we become extremely shallow. We're losing the essence of who we are. And, whilst I love and I adore technology, we're actually evolving our technology at such a fast rate that we do not understand the impact it has on our human behavior, on cognition, on emotional intelligence, on health, mental health issues, emotional issues. And this is what I wrote about in #loneliness, to really humanity to awaken to what's really happening. Because if we don't and we do not act now, we're going to really continue to destroy what our predecessors worked very hard for us to build.
Now, it's really interesting as you talk about technology, which you certainly talk quite a bit about in your book in some of the most interesting ways, but again, that was almost the feeling that I thought this book would be about, is how technology might have carved a wedge in between what we're naturally inclined to do and what we're actually doing now. In fact, in your book you talk about a particular, I guess it was a poll that was taken that showed, I believe it was in the year 1984 when this poll was taken, it showed that most people had at least 3 friends. And then I think it was by 2004, which was about, let's just say about 30 years later, 20, 30 years later, that it reduced down to maybe 1, and now it's believed that it goes down to 0 this day and age in 2016. And I found that very alarming, but you can see something that's different between the 1980s and this new millennium is the fact that then the only way we connected with people, outside of face-to-face was by the telephone. So that technology wasn't there anymore. So you were actually in a position, you had to feel what it was like to stand in front of somebody, to actually talk to them, to actually have that immediate perception of who they are and who they think you are, versus now you can hide.
Very easily you can hide behind technological screens. I mean, it's exactly this, where if you really become extremely alert in your day-to-day life, and you walk from the morning you walk out of your door in your house to whatever you're doing throughout the day, you'll see people glued to their mobile phones. And, you can pass every single person and they won't even look at your eyes anymore. And the strangest thing is, I'm not sure where you are, if it's the same, but I observe that in London and when I travel globally with my clients, it's like if you strike a conversation with a random person, it's become really offensive. People say, what do you want from me? Instead of just being able to share and connect wherever you are. People fear to strike a conversation with a random stranger.
Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting you say that because there's a lot of truth to that. You can actually sense the energy coming from them that says, you're bothering me.
Yeah.
Versus that genuine, okay, I'd be kind of interested in talking with you. I mean, you're seeming nice enough. And, I actually take public transportation when I go downtown, and I see exactly the phenomenon you're talking about. I look at it out on the streets. Everybody, it's almost like they've been born with these contraptions in their hands with their eyes permanently glued. It's like, are you triangulating yourself? Are you Google mapping the direction to go in this city block here to get to the store? What's going on here that is so important that you need to have that phone with you so you don't miss a call or whatever the case. Not that anybody talks anymore, everybody texts. I've been in restaurants where couples are actually sitting down to dinner. A couple out to dinner. Generally, that's considered that romantic time you kind of want to share with each other. And both people are sitting there with their cell phones waiting for their food.
Yep, absolutely. It's happening everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's really happening everywhere. And it is for this reason that when I chose the subject of the next book, I really went into meditative state. And I said, what is it that billions of people globally are experiencing in this moment in time? And I literally silenced my mind, and the hashtag loneliness came about.
Now, I like that you used hashtag loneliness. Now, if we were to say that 10 years ago, people would be looking for the word hashtag and then loneliness. But nowadays, we know exactly what hashtag is, so that's why I wanted to be sure to get that in there. But, You're not somebody who decided to study this phenomenon about loneliness, what it is to be alone, what are the differences, but you were actually somebody through growing up in the adversities that you faced, and they were pretty severe, actually. Share with our audience how that had, what was going on there and how you evolved to get to the point that you are now.
I was born in a very small town in Western Macedonia called Gostivar. I come from a family of restaurateurs, and I grew up with my grandparents, and my family were mostly away from the town, working in another country now, which is Bosnia-Herzegovina. And from the moment I was born with a disability, and I wasn't able to walk for the first 3 years of my life. And I could very clearly recall observing the world and all the children playing around me and me not being able to join them, and observing the world from stillness. But not just from that, but also I started observing how the society works, how people communicate to one another, and what was the mental and emotional and physical abuse that was happening around me. And my entire being was rejecting that. My entire being was saying, surely there's more to life. Surely there's a way for these people to heal, and surely there's a way for these people to communicate in a loving way with one another. Now, having passed that first adversity, I actually was struck by a severe illness, both pneumonia and heart illness and many multiple organ failures that left me almost dying in hospital at the age of 9. And while the medical industry and medical science and the doctors who were looking after me back then gave up and told my parents, especially my mom got the first news that I have only 3 days to live, my mother took me to the very same spiritual teachers and healers when I was born, who told her I will be one of the greatest healers on the planet, that I'll be traveling around the world and doing amazing work for the planet. My mom turned around and said, well, he's dying, your predictions are wrong. And I with almost half a memory, remember how this old man who was treating me back then laughed at my mother, took me over and said, he'll be okay. And 6 months down the line, just doing a lot of work with this man, my body started coming back into balance, and I started healing until I reached perfect health. But it wasn't that enough. I actually consistently went through almost another adversity where also sexual abuse happened as a child. And if that wasn't enough, then we had the civil war in former Yugoslavia, which displaced millions of people. And a lot of people lost their lives. I lost friends and family during that war. And that left me homeless and arriving by miracle in London. And I remember the first 4 or 5 months in London, I was homeless, sleeping on the streets of London, sleeping at the bridges of River Thames, and crying every single day, asking myself the questions about humanity, about God, about religion, about everything that I was taught, but I did not see that in my reality anymore. I simply lost faith in who we are as people. And something within me consistently drove me to literally seek the answer. What is it that drives us to be so nasty to one another? What is it that a 19-year-old boy ends up on the streets of London, coming from a great family, wants a great country, and suddenly it's in a full civil war, everything being destroyed by the second, by the hour, and people killing one another, the very same people who were neighbors before, the very same people who were married, the very same children who come from the same marriage. I just wanted to know the answer, what makes people excellent and what makes people animal in their nature. And in this journey, I spent the next 10 years in London working 24 hours every day. That's how I used to sleep, about 3-4 hours, to educate myself and go on that search of healing my pain inside of me. I came across some amazing people who helped me through this journey. I graduated from one of the top universities in London, University College of London, doing an engineering degree with organizational behavior and human behavior, because I wanted to understand we're creating this technology, but we actually are the technology. We are the most sophisticated technology that ever existed. And I love both, but I always wanted to understand this technology inside of us and what are those viruses that makes us behave in a way that we destruct and destroy one another. And I continued to build my professional technology career. I became a CIO, program manager, IT manager, the lot. And in the background, I loved studying and investing in my personal, professional, spiritual, and healing work that I did to really support myself and become a better person. In 2009 and 2008, with a global financial crisis, I faced redundancy. And yet again, I almost was sent again to live on the streets of London with no support. From earning a great salary and having massive commitments and supporting my family back in the war zone, to suddenly somebody telling me, you have no job and you're on your own. And that gave me the next awakening that I said to myself, oh my God, clearly I'm here to do something bigger than this. And I do not want to support a system or an organization that treats their people in such a way with no care. I wanted to be somebody who creates an environment or a product or a service that nurtures people and brings people together, because with all of my heart in this journey of overcoming all the life adversities that I mentioned in #aloneness, I learned the secret formula. I learned the steps and the conscious engineering processes that people can use to elevate their mind and open their heart to love, gratitude, and empathy. And I also learned that love is the greatest healer for all of us. And if anybody is experiencing any form of mental, physical, emotional problems, even financial problems, it's because of that lack of self-worthiness and everything that happened to that person in their own life. And I started my entrepreneurial journey, through which I finished a course called Become Key Person of Influence, where I actually published my first book called A Path to Wisdom, How to Live a Healthy, Balanced, and Peaceful Life, and where I created the unique methodology, the TJS evolutionary method, which is 5-step method with 25 conscious engineering processes to help people create a perfect health, tremendous balance in their life, and find that inner peace from which they can hear their soul's voice, from which then they can be a beacon of light for humanity and be of service to humanity.
Now, you've definitely hit on some key things here that I think should be very important for our listeners to know, and that is conditioning. It sounds to me like because of what had occurred in your life, you made a choice not to be lonely. I'm sure many people who may have traveled in your footsteps, or at least closely resembling those footsteps, could be like the Scrooge at Christmas, just bitter about everything. Well, I've got what I need, but forget everybody else. When was the world ever kind to me? And that was certainly a conditioned way that you would learn that perception about the world. And I was just thinking about a couple of things here. Now, you were saying you came from a pretty good family, which is fantastic, but that you had adversities happen. And then you take a look at, for instance, there are a couple of things that really began to emerge that I've talked with guests throughout the years about. Let's take a look at our school system. And I know in Europe, especially in England and Britain, it's pretty rough, with the teachers and the students, but it's even rougher, with the students themselves. I mean, school is that place, you worry about who's the toughest kid in class and try to avoid them, avoid the bully, you want to be liked, accepted. You want to be able to play on the playground with the rest of the kids, so you do what you need to do that gets you into that inner circle. And but what I also found interesting about education reflection, this also comes from guests that we've had on the program here, is that when you take a look at the system of how education is designed, especially, and I can only use really America as an example, having been raised in America, but you realize that you're basically trying to get the right answer, and if you don't, then you must be flawed. Well, if Billy over there got the right answer, what's wrong with you? And basically we all really do learn in different ways, but we do learn. Then you take the next step and you are conditioned, let's say, by your family. This is the way you should follow your path. And I grew up learning, you get a good education, then you get out there, you get a career, then you get yourself a wife, you have kids, you live happily ever after, then you retire. But we all know somehow inside of ourselves there's a lot of nonsense there, because you feel like there's some sort of cookie-cutter way that you go about life, and any of us, such as yourself, who have lived life, realizes life is not a linear process. Then let's think about the world of work. So now you go and you land this career, this great job that hopefully has this potential for you to grow and develop and maybe even make more money, and you realize now I'm seeking approval in my behavior from others, so I'm asking you to judge me on my performance and who I am, to see if I can get to that next level of better income, better status, a better position in the company. And you realize somebody has decided, who's paying you, to decide when that's going to happen, and you realize most of the time it isn't so much your performance that's being graded, but it's basically politics, and that can all shift depending on how well people play the game. So you realize you've been through this lifetime of conditioning, and I've heard this consistently from people who have approached midlife, and that was one of the reasons our show exists, is that they realize I have done everything I thought I was supposed to do. I don't feel any better about where I am in life. I feel a certain emptiness, like I really haven't pursued what I wanted, and certainly I'm starting to feel maybe a little bit of that bitterness where I just don't want to talk to anybody as though I've been cheated by other people through a lifetime. What are your thoughts about that?
Everything you've mentioned, it's things that I actually go through #loneliness and a path to wisdom, but also things that every individual planetary is going through. Now, in UK, it's no different to America, it's just another different programming. But the word is we are conditioned in every single layer of the society. And now we have a global awakening of the truth within ourselves. And there are some amazing teachers out there that, like myself, are dedicated to revealing the truth and to help people move away from that not feeling good enough. Now, yes, in UK, for instance, I've seen that working in the corporate world for more than 19 years, that when you reach a certain age, you become disposable. Nobody wants to re-employ you again, meaning there's a whole pool of experts around the world who they are 45, 50, 55, 60, that for no reason they've been taken out of their jobs apart from financial reasons, And they're feeling exactly what you said, feeling resentful because they spent 20 years, 30 years to build a career and actually to give their best in a company. Yet, when they've been maturing that wisdom, they've been made redundant. This was what hit me in 2009, saying, I studied extremely hard. I worked extremely hard. I collected all of those qualifications, and then I was of service to many companies to help them make millions using and utilizing technology. And then in a sudden downturn in economy, companies have lost now that faith in people, that instead of harnessing that wisdom and saying, how can we create products and services so when the economy turns on the other side, we can actually be ready and sell and grow the company, the first thing they do is get rid of people. And then people don't have that support or the skills required for them to bring their wisdom into some form of product so they don't feel useless. And the problem with technology, and the problem I actually highlighted in one of the chapters in #Loneliness, which is the technological Armageddon, it's what Professor Stephen Hawking also highlights, which is basically we come into a point in history, never before, where singularity is now closer and closer a reality. Meaning in the next 10 years, we'll be hitting the singularity point, where artificial intelligence will take over human intelligence, creating a whole new set of problems in the society, a new set of unemployment, because there'll be no human being who can actually compete with a computer, artificial intelligence that is conscious and can access the global data in a second. And whilst we start deploying more and more artificial intelligence to actually replace human jobs, we're going to have more and more people feeling exactly like those people you explained earlier on in the show. So all of those problems which are being created in the background as a result of actually doing some amazing technological advancements are not being dealt with. What will happen? So it is in our nature when we feel useless to feel lonely, to feel isolated. And it is why, another why, and many other whys, I said to myself, I must do something about it. If there's no point of me thinking about it, I must put this in writing and bring it to the hearts of 1 billion people. It is my mission to bring this book in the minds and in the hearts of 1 billion people, because I believe with all my heart that if every person read the book and actually embodied the principles and learned the wisdom behind that, they can be back into service for us to have a move together into a more crowd-nurtured peace and just society.
Now, what I really enjoyed reading about your book, especially, there's a lot of good, deep philosophy, but very straightforward, practical, spiritual wisdom. Now, one of the things that you highlight, we feel lonely because we feel separate from another person. We feel disconnected when, in fact, we're all interconnected together. As I like to say, especially as, there was a time when I was building and developing teams of people. Look, my job isn't any better or any more important than yours is. My job is to get you to a point that we're all in this and interdependent and successful together. Yep. We always hear that, you're always as strong as your weakest link. Well, there's a lot of truth in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, it's interesting how our imprinting helps or actually motivates us in unusual ways to go get what we think we want, when in reality we're trying to find a way to heal that feeling of being separate. You give an excellent example of a woman who was going through a series of just not so, I guess, nurturing relationships. And I'm sure you remember the story. Share that one a little bit with our listeners, because this comes from early childhood imprinting. And this could be one of those situations, maybe the person didn't have the greatest childhood with, good parents. And that happens a lot, especially, in America, where 1 in 2 marriages end in divorce. We are a country full of single parents, and especially children, and especially in the African American community, where boys don't even really know their fathers in most cases.
Correct. I mean, I was fortunate from a perspective of growing up in a very hardworking family who did everything to educate us. That said, we did not have the emotional intelligence that I'm teaching now. I did not grow up with emotionally intelligent parents. So therefore, there were so many judgments and fears in my own family, meaning none of us were encouraged to speak our truth. We constantly had to say yes to anything that was being told to us. Now, I've seen thousands of people and helped them through millions of issues that people come and see me for. But when it comes to really talking about a relationship, when it comes to talking about children, and when it comes to talking about conscious parenting, they all have one thing in common. And that thing in common is basically, if we are not really aligned to our inner wisdom, if we're not really aligned to our true, authentic values, we will operate from a space of injected values. And which means the values of the society, the schools we've been through the experiences we've gone to, religion, parenting, and everything that happened to us. But for most children, they try to mimic their parents. Women, in specifically, they will go for somebody who's like their father. Or men, on the other hand, they'll go for somebody who's nurturing as their mother, without ever growing into their true, authentic, individual self with their own set of values, with their own voice. And when people start coming together into a relationship, if they haven't done this work, they will have a lot of adversities as they go and get to know each other. Because that period, the honeymoon period, as I call, and will pass very quickly. Then you start to really see the true nature of that person. And then we start judging them, and we isolate, we start creating loneliness in there. And before we know it, we end up in divorce. And as you mentioned, divorce is a global problem. In America, in UK, and anywhere around the world. And not only impacts those two people, but if the parties who get divorced have children, those children will live with those scars until some of them awaken and do the real work in them to be able to let go of the pain they experience through the eyes of their parents. So it is really essential to understand the behaviors, to understand the underlying programming that each one of us has in order for us to have much better communication with one another, much better connection, and so much more love. Because we are connected, like it or not. Science has proven that to us many, many times over and over and over, whilst our perceptions do not see that connection. We see layers and we see labels. But when we go beyond those labels, and I've seen that how in myself, I went through so many labels to be able to be where I am today. And even being a human behavior expert and cognition expert and a spiritual teacher and a healer is just another label. So beyond those labels, there's an infinite soul with infinite possibilities to create and destroy life. We have the power of destruction and creation in each human being. If we learn how to really truly harness that power and how to appreciate that power in one another, we would have such a better world.
Now, let's define, for instance, there is a difference between loneliness and alone, isn't there?
Absolutely. So the feeling of loneliness, I mean, we can describe it in many, many different ways. But I can show it to you from the things that I've come across and personally, is this one-sided negative emotion that people experience, something that is extremely painful to them. And this comes from not belonging or being disconnected from something that truly matters to them. But in fact, from really being disconnected from a collective consciousness. Because in the essence, when we are born, we are the same human being wherever you are. And we get programmed on the way. So the loneliness occurs when there is a discrepancy between the quantity and quality of social relationships that we want with one another and those that we have. And equally, if we have something, for instance, I mean, a lot of people who approach me and they look at the title and say, I'm not lonely. But when you start having a conversation with them, they might be lonely in a thought. Like, for instance, Democrats and Republicans in America. You know, I've never seen this. Well, I think humanity hasn't seen what really happened in America with Brexit, where all this anger came out from the very same people, from the very same country. Instead of being connected and working as one consciousness, they became lonely from one another,
right,
living in the same city, living in the same family. So it's that perception, psychological perception that we create as a result of our unmet expectations or unmet need of belonging.
And it is fascinating, too, because I remember during this whole process, and especially after getting back to the election here briefly, is that I would ask people, okay, for instance, so you hate Donald Trump, huh? So what is it about Donald Trump that you don't like? Okay. So they would list off all these things, well, this, and okay. Well, what are you doing about this in the world that you can make that better? Since it's all his fault anyway, right? Or it could be Hillary Clinton. It could be just the opposite. What don't you like about what she's doing or who she is? Well, what are you doing individually as a person or even with other people, that can change that in the world? Because you recognize those flaws. I understand that you recognize them in yourself. I remember a 5th grade teacher who once said, when you point your finger and blame at somebody for something, just remember you have 3 fingers pointing back at you.
Absolutely. I use this all the time. My grandfather taught me the same technique when I was like 6 years old.
But you see, the thing that's really interesting is you talk in your book that we really create our reality. And I know that you believe that. I can see by your writing you totally understand that. And I tell people, when you can come to understand what we're talking about here, it will change you. You will realize, wow, I'm more interconnected with people than I can imagine. They say, well, what about this guy who's a real jerk at work? Well, discover what is it about that person that's pushing your emotional buttons that causes you to think that way in the first place. And you'll be surprised that you've created this person to actually mirror you to work on something there, that these people are actually blessings more than they are troublemakers.
Yep.
Now, I always find it fascinating here. Now, let's talk about some of the ways that you break through loneliness here.
There are many ways you can break through loneliness. With any problem in life, coming as an engineer, I always take anything as a problem and then I find the way to create the solution. With loneliness itself, the first thing that every human being can do is simply to sit down, pen and paper, and write down what makes them feel lonely. In which area in their life they actually feel lonely. Because loneliness is such a colorful experience that most people at glance, they do not recognize it in themselves. Because sometimes it comes very aggressive, where, for instance, when it comes somebody passing away in our life, or when sudden friendship ends, or when you lose your job, or let's say you lost your money, or whatever it might be, there's some really massive signs that can give you straight away the feeling of loneliness. But there are a lot of hidden factors which we do not see. And those hidden factors could be, for instance, illness. Could be some form of emotional pain which is sitting in there from long time ago. Could be something, your parents told you that you're not good enough, or they criticize you, they don't really support you in what you do. Or it could be in your cognitive functions, such as sleep disorders, insomnia, sleep inversion, dementia, Alzheimer's disease. Those are all results of loneliness. So on a physical health level, for instance, when people experience somatic disorders such as gastritis, gastric ulcers, rhythmic heart disorder, high blood pressure, impairment of the immune system, diabetes, obesity, there's something happening to them for the body to respond. For me as a teacher now, and having really collected so much knowledge and wisdom, I can see how our body is simply one massive, sophisticated communication device. And when we do not listen to that, our body will respond with some sort of disorder or some form of emotional pain or mental pain or physical pain or the symptoms which I mentioned. So for people to overcome something, the first thing they must do is actually find out what form loneliness takes in their life.
It's interesting. This is certainly the business to be in if you want to clean out the clutter, so to speak.
Yep.
And I'm sure you've experienced this yourself, and I had the wonderful opportunity some years back where I interviewed actress Dee Wallace. People might remember her from movies such as E.T., the Extraterrestrial. She actually played the mother.
That movie.
And she wrote a wonderful book that talked about her spiritual journey of discoverment as being an actress. And it was really a fascinating read. We had a really wonderful time talking about this, and she says, there was a point she was talking about this where she was taking acting lessons from a guy who was known as the Zen actor's coach, but he no longer does this. And it was really interesting. I thought, if you really want to heal, taking acting classes would be a great way to start. Because think of what you have to do to be successful in something like that. First of all, you got to be in front of other people. 2, you've got to be willing to do things that you're not comfortable with doing a lot of times. And 3, you've got to learn how to handle the fact that you're going to be criticized. But see, those are the things that, for instance, our technologically driven society hides us from. I'll give you an idea. I'm sitting here now, and I'm looking at this chat board, and we got this nice, intelligent conversation going on with a guy that is upset because I decided to go ahead and block his chat, because basically what he is, he's like one of them YouTube trolls. This is all he's got to say here is a bunch of nasty stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, is this what we're doing? What would he be like if he was sitting in front of all of us trying to say these things? It just wouldn't happen. But it's interesting, isn't it, how the world works that way?
Absolutely, it's interesting. And, this is one of the things that we are intelligent beings beyond our comprehension. And we're not really using the capacity of that intelligence in ourselves. This is another form of loneliness that we have, that basically we are afraid to actually use the true power that we have. And changing those behaviors and changing our default comfort zone. I actually don't call it comfort zone, I call it familiar zone. And then you go for something bold, something that creates a dent in the universe, something that you can actually literally be the leader, like Steve Jobs and Richard Branson and all these amazing people who actually change the way we live our lives. Microsoft, we look at Bill Gates, and I feel absolutely inspired by global leaders who really created something that shifted the way we as human beings operate.
So there's no doubt about that as well. And it's, not a matter of having technology actually replace what we do naturally, which is certainly being social. I remember I was watching a documentary on video games, and it, began to evolve into where it was talking about the reality video games that you can now play, where you connect on a global scale and you can play with other people or against other people, and you can actually develop relationships, which people are doing. And what was really interesting about this is what one guy said. He says, to play, for instance, Warcraft, which is probably the biggest game there is out there, he says you've really got to, if you're going to get to the higher levels, you've got to really make a time commitment to do this. And he says, but it comes at a cost. He says, after a year of really putting my time and effort into getting to these different levels and achieving success in Warcraft, he says, it took me close to 6 months once I broke away from that to redevelop my social skills, because, when you're in this pseudo-reality, so to speak, sure, you're communicating, and sure, there might be some truth in what you're communicating, but it's much different than if you were to stand in front of somebody and do the very same thing. And that's the thing you're seeing dwindling is social skills. And here's what's really interesting to share with you, Tony. When I grew up, I was pretty much in a different school every year from preschool until the 6th grade. It wasn't until I hit the 6th grade that I was in the same school for more than a year. Okay, so I was a guy that moved around a lot. Well, because I grew up in the late 1960s, early 70s, that sort of a thing, with the moving around, I learned how to be the new guy in class, but I wasn't the one they said, here's the new guy in class, I'm going to be shy, and before you know it, 3 weeks later, everybody's wondering, well, where did that person go? That shy kid. I was the one who was seeking out the alpha male. I was very competitive, but I also liked to joke and laugh and that sort of a thing. And so over the years, I grew up knowing how to develop quick rapport with people, building relationships, but accepting the fact that sometimes relationships just end because you move and you just don't stay in touch. Excuse me. So in realizing that, there's a small, subtle thing that came into me where I started feeling that I was always alone outside the group. As you can see why. But rather than having that kind of burn me, I started developing the fact, well, what is this like to really be alone and enjoy that? There's no crime in that whatsoever. I still socially interact with people. I'm probably one of the last people on earth that doesn't own a cell phone. Still, I mean, this is how I talk to people on the phone, and if, they want to reach me, they can reach me, and they can leave a message, and I'll get back to them, There's no reason for me to have to sit there. Did they call? Because I did own a cell phone one time, and I was sitting there, and it became like heroin. And I said, no, I'm done with this. I got rid of it. But now they're computers, for crying out. That's when you could just call people and receive messages, but now you got computers in your hand, and people are playing Candy Crush, for crying out loud. And it's all because they want to alleviate boredom, and I say, what is so wrong with boredom? That's when you get to quietly listen to who you are, and that's one of the biggest things you talk about in your book.
Yeah. It's this big difference between loneliness and enjoying the experience of aloneness. One thing that people must be careful, and I really highlight throughout the book, it's not doing it for the wrong reasons. Meaning, let's say somebody is introvert, and they justify their introversion through taking time to be alone. It's different where we take the time to recharge our batteries and to really enjoy our aloneness and heal, to actually doing it from a reason that we are not prepared to face in reality. Does it make sense?
Absolutely. Now, you talk in your book about listening to your alarm. Describe what that is exactly.
Alarm. Alarm is part of the TJS evolutionary method, which I wrote in my first best-selling book, A Path to Wisdom. And having meditated for almost 8 weeks, 8 hours a day.
Wow.
And having done a lot of engineering and studying science, maths, and physics, since I was a child, I wanted to create a manual for humanity. Because I remember looking at all the technology, the TVs and the radios, they all came with a manual for me to set them up when my father would bring them home. I always used to ask the question why we as people don't have a manual to tune ourselves to our best version of ourselves. And that feeling of trying to answer that followed me for 40 years until I wrote the book. And when I did that meditation, one thing I consistently ask in my meditation from higher guidance, spirits, universe, God, whatever you might call it, I wanted to know what is it, one system that connects us all, but also that awakens us all. And the acronym came ALARM, which means that this intelligence that creates everything we see in our reality surely has inbuilt alarm that alarms us when we are not aligned to that intelligence. And there's a massive body intelligence that billions of cells and organs work together in our body for us to function on a daily basis. And this system must have a unique alarm system to alarm us where it's not at its optimum. So alarm is really that inbuilt alarm system that our body has when we are not living our true greatness. And the basis of that is 5 pillars, which is acknowledge, love, achieve, results, miracles. Which means when we truly come to a place within ourselves that we truly acknowledge who we are, what our capabilities are, and rebalance our perceptions and equilibrate our mind, we open our heart to gratitude and love. When we do that, we bring ourselves in true inner balance where we simply shine and radiate. We become a mirror for humanity, for them to find their own way, their own path. Our body, our physiology comes into perfect health. Therefore, from that space, we can achieve results that people normally associate and call miracles.
As I remember one guest said one time during an interview, he says, miracles are just experiences that we haven't had any experience with yet.
Yep.
And I thought, yeah, that's about as simple as it gets.
Yep.
Now, it's really amazing, too, when you think about our thinking about things, and I remember years ago I was talking with a friend of mine who had been married for a year, and then she came to tell me that she was divorced. I said, geez, after one whole year, that must have been one heck of a relationship. I said, so what happened? She says, well, he just wasn't the same guy I fell in love with. And I thought, it kind of reminded me back. There's a wonderful documentary out there when you can find it. It's called A Warrior's Journey, and it's about legendary martial artist Bruce Lee. And there's a scene in there where he's working with, it was an actor, Francisco. I'm trying to remember his name off the bat. It eludes me. And so what he was saying is, as they were kind of matching up and they get done with their little bit of a sparring match there, and he says, so what is it that I need to know, or what is it that changed you? And he says, I discovered the cause of my ignorance. And I meditated on that for a long time, and here's one of the interesting things we've been talking about on the show. The way also to alleviate yourself from loneliness is to accept 100% responsibility for everything that happens in your life. And we seem to be driven in a society that has lawyers that are saying we need to blame these people, hold them accountable, and, of course, get that compensation. That's the most important thing. But the fact is, and you hear people, and it's interesting when you shift just that simple perception that I accept everything that happens in my life, good and bad. The question is, of course, how you deal with it. But once you do that, it is amazing how wonderful life changes, and it seems to get easier in many ways, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's basically, there's many people out there who use fancy words, but they don't really mean the words you just spoke, which I live by. Meaning everything about my reality is my creation, meaning the good and the bad. Unfortunately for society, for humanity, we are being programmed daily to be polarized. And also to look for a solution outside of ourselves, and also creating products and services that literally bring people far away from owning their reality, meaning from being empowered and being creators of the reality. I've had people, such as when they get involved in crime, and I had judges who consulted me about exactly this issue, where a judge was totally unsure about making a decision which he deep down felt is wrong. But everything about the legal system he had to follow for him to say it's right. So he came for a consultation, and one of the things he started sharing with me, and I'm listening to that, and I said to him, so you believe on one hand that it takes two to co-create reality, meaning this session would not happen if both of us said yes, correct? Yes. I said, so what makes you think that the crime happened without both parties agreeing to it? And he could not give me an answer. And I said, imagine, here I am, a spiritual teacher, and a lot of people, I do a lot of healing work. Imagine, let's say, that I'm able to bring the person, the soul of that person, to be on trial. How would your legal system work then? Because let's say somebody murdered somebody, and let's say for argument's sake, either he's guilty or not guilty. Let's say he's guilty. What happens in our justice system, this is a whole new topic I can talk to you about for years. It's we build this system in a way that it's one-sided. And I said, well, the other person is not there for us to really get the full picture. We can only get the full picture from other people and the person who we actually judge. But imagine if we had the other person and we equilibrated the perception, and we actually got to find out exactly what they did in their own reality for that reality to happen. Would you judge them? He went like, no. It's the same, even if the person wasn't guilty. It's the same thing, because if the other person is guilty and it's gone, he's not going to talk. And there's no person around them who actually really, truly knows what happened 100% in that reality for that reality to be co-created and therefore the other party to be guilty. It is very unfortunate that not just the education system, not just the legal system, but also the government and the politics, it's been set up in a way to separate people, instead of actually in a way to inspire people and to connect people and to literally look at the reality that we create as full ownership of each individual. And when we do that, as you said, transformation happens in ourselves and life changes. I remember the anger I used to have. If you interviewed me in 1990 when I was on the streets of London, I simply hated what happened in former Yugoslavia. I hated the parties in the war who created that. I hated Europe for not intervening and protecting people. I was full of hatred. And it's natural for any human being when they put in circumstances which literally takes away everything they know, and they see atrocities in the front of their eyes as children, they will actually doubt about the reality. It is potentially what really took me to study and read thousands of books and work with experts to really understand that I'm the creator of the reality, even if I'm in that civil war.
Interesting interview, and I was so glad to have this guy on the program, Dr. Hugh Len. He was the one who's well known for introducing people to Hawaiian Ho'oponopono. Mm-hmm. And he was a doctor that went to this place. It was a prison where they housed people who were very dangerous, criminally insane in some cases, murderers, rapists, you name it. I mean, it was in some ways the worst of the worst. And so his job was to be the, prison psychologist. So all of a sudden I started noticing over time as this guy took over this chair of office that pretty soon these criminals were starting to become nicer. They were starting to be very socially adept. They were starting to connect with the guards. And it was getting to a point where some of them were starting to being granted, little temporary liberties to actually step outside the prison for a half a day or whatever. And eventually, as time went on, they were being released. They were actually considered to be, they've paid their debt. They seem like they can function in society. We're going to go ahead and let them go. And it was curious, so they looked into that to say, what is this guy doing here that's causing this? And he says, okay, well, if you really want to know, this is what I'm doing. I'll sit here and I'll open up a file. I'll take a look at everything here, and then I'll simply say, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, and I love you. And he was doing a form of personal cleansing that way. Because he felt that each and every one of these people were a result of his reality being co-created, that all he was doing was finding a way to forgive that in himself. That energy simply transferred over to these people, and it changed them. And he says, do you ever notice that when you have a hardship, whatever it is, it could be a car crash, some random event, but do you notice that you're always there? If you don't take personal responsibility, then maybe it's time for another evolution or reincarnation so you get it.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. I wish we had another hour or so to go on this, because like I said, it's a fascinating book. It was much different than I expected here. I would love to have you back on the program, but in the meantime, is there a website people can find out more about your work?
Absolutely. People can go on TonySelimi.com, TonySelimi, SELIMI.com, and they can connect with me there. They'll find all the links to all the different books and also different seminars and talks and programs that I do. But also I write a blog, monthly I write a blog to help them really start on this journey. And people can also download a free chapter of any of my books. And for people who don't like read, they can download audiobook, a chapter of one of my audiobooks. So they can really start this journey and truly understand, because the mission is really to inspire and awaken hearts globally. And as you said, especially the last point about when you talk about prison service, we've created such an unjust society, and I am a firm believer with the right nurturing, with the right education, with the right love and ownership, we can transform people's lives.
I totally agree with you. So, in closing here, I guess it's fair to say, Tony, that loneliness is a choice, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's the difficult part is for actually to become aware that it is a choice. Mm-hmm. Once we come to that awareness that we have a choice, that the journey afterwards becomes easier.
And that's a fact. Like I said, once I started accepting 100% responsibility for everything in my life, that includes the good as well as the bad, it just really, it was enlightening. It was just really, really amazing. Again, the book is #Loneliness, The Virus of the Modern Age. Our guest today, Tony Selimi. And one more time for our listeners, what is that website address?
TonySelimi.com.
Very good. Tony, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today and bringing this important work to the world. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Daniel, so much for having me on your show.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You can also take some personal responsibility by dialing into Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. Discover more there about upcoming shows and stay connected with what's going on in the Beyond 50 community. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Beyond 50 Radio as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.